Hello. Inspired photographers Neil Richmond, John Altmorfor, Katie Evans, Martha Worth, Brian Bogovich, Jason Furdo, Anita Buzzi Prentice, Dave Hodgendonner, and Eric and Tamboro welcome you to Inspired in Crisis. We've all responded to the COVID crisis in different ways. Some of us clung to our art practices as if they were a life preserver in the storm. Others took the opportunity to try new techniques and tackle projects that they never could quite find the time for. As fear and despair surrounded us, some sought to bring hope to the city. There was no wrong or right response to have. As we experienced the last year and a half, we learned a great deal about ourselves. In this exhibition, participants of the Inspired Photographers Group look back and reflect on their own personal response to the pandemic and share their work and how they remained inspired in crisis. Hosted by Anita Buzzi Prentice, Inspired Photographers is a group of creative people sharing their most personal, passionate, and amazing photographic masterpieces, or total messes, learning and collaborating with friends and colleagues to keep photography fun. Welcome to the exhibition. Our first photographer is Erica Tamboro. Erica Tamboro's artist statements is as follows. I am a multi-exposure photographer on a journey to create a process unique and true to myself as an artist using an in-camera multiple exposure techniques. Challenged by an early assertion that photography isn't art, I am driven to experiment with my creative process. In my current process, I create alcohol ink paintings or glass panels. I then capture an image using 2 or 3 exposures of the painting, a flower, and sometimes an additional element for color or texture. The result is a wonderfully surprising image, initially attracting the viewer with bright and inviting colors, and then drawing them in to explore unexpected details. Ultimately, my process honors the human condition, our complexity as beings, and my desire to learn how to release my control to the creative process. My art has saved me numerous times in my life, including giving me a means to deal with the trauma of the COVID pandemic. When the coronavirus reached Pittsburgh, the lockdowns, instead of making me feel safe, severely triggered my claustrophobia and anxiety. That was the first time I had ever experienced not feeling safe in my own home. I couldn't control what was going on around me or my emotional response, but I could create. I discovered farms that I could order beautiful fresh flowers from, self-care in itself, and threw myself into my art. The year continued to be the most challenging time that I've experienced, but my ability to create photographs that I find delightful and fulfilling helped me remember the beauty that will always surround us, no matter the circumstances. Erica's images include I Can. Lily. The Productive Struggle. Start Where You Are. Guided. And Legacy. The next photographer is Anita Buzzi Prentice. Her artist statement is as follows. During the COVID pandemic, I had a lot of time to think about what was important to me and what I really wanted to do next as a photographer. I've been a portrait photographer for over 25 years, but I got to a point where I knew I had to take a step in a new direction and add some new flavor to my repertoire. I used to be a dancer and have always loved beautiful photographs of professional dancers, so I decided to take a course of study with one of my favorite dance photo photographers, Rachel Neville, in New York City. Through Zoom sessions with her and my own photo shoots with Pittsburgh dancers, I created photos of motion and energy that really lit my heart up. I have compiled a collection of photos of 30 dancers and gathered their interviews for a book I am working on entitled Waiting in the Wings, due to be published this coming spring. The photos and thoughts these dancers shared have an overriding feeling of hope. These dancers desire to return to the stage, and in the same way as many creative people feel when they have their art taken away for whatever reason, that spirit and drive burns brighter than ever. When you find something you truly love and you are forced to take a break, you can come back stronger, better, and with a newfound appreciation. COVID has taken away so much from all of us, but I see this as a gift of the pandemic. Some time to pause, think, and reappreciate whatever it is that we love about life. Anita's first photograph is Anna and Taylor. Her second photograph is Corey. Third photograph is Chloe. Up next is Julia. Isabella. And finally, Jill. Our next photographer is Neil Richmond. Neil Richmond's artist statement is as follows. I photograph people, events, and products. Baby ballerinas, old people drinking, and plumbing parts. COVID-19 stopped all of that. I found work photographing food on location. I photographed in mostly empty restaurants in 3 states, large and small, all kinds of food and all kinds of locations. The restaurants that created the food for my photos deserve the recognition, and I hope that they survive the pandemic and prosper. Neil's first photograph is titled Mola. His second is titled Modern Cafe. His third, Cafe Des amis. Spice affair. Max and Irma's. And low-key taco. Our next photographer is Jason Furdo. Jason Furdo's artist statement is as follows. Being a creator these past 16 months has saved my sanity. I truly believe that if I was out without my camera and a drive to make art, my life would be immeasurably worse. 9.5 years ago, I decided to challenge myself with the Picture a Day project. It took me a little over a month to realize that I'd chosen to start it on a leap year. I set boundaries and rules for myself that kept me honest, but allowed me to grow and push outside of my comfort zone. 366 days after I began, I rested and reflected on this, the largest project I'd taken on to date. I was pleased to have finished it, but I was glad that it was complete. A little under 4 years later, I gave it another go and pulled out another win. When January 1st, 2020 rolled around, there wasn't a doubt in my mind that I'd be capturing, editing, and posting an image every day of the year. I even had the best title picked out, 2020 Perfect Vision. Like everyone else, I was blindsided by the worst pandemic in history. Halting the project was out of the question. I'm stubborn. That's a major component of my drive. If nothing else, I'd do more studio work or find things to photograph in the backyard. Failure was not an option, and for that, I'm forever thankful. My approach to a leap year project is to rotate themes to keep things interesting, but one particular concept kept presenting itself. One of my favorite subjects is to document old and abandoned places. I love the textures of decay, the way that nature begins to reclaim a space, and the contrast of how a space has transitioned from occupied to empty. At first, the lockdown felt a lot like being in an abandoned place. If I had to travel out into the world, there was a strange quiet everywhere, like a winter evening after a heavy snow. This made me comfortable in an odd way. It made me want to document those abandoned places even more. And how ironic was it that one of the safest places for me to be was away from others in an abandoned building. I could continue my passion without the danger of the pandemic. Of course, all of the usual dangers of this pastime were still present. Collected here are some of my most memorable creations from 2020. I saw old farmhouses, collapsing train tunnels, places where the ill received treatment, places where a congregation's voices were directed to the heavens, and places where industry was once a bustle. I feel fortunate to have walked in these locations, and I'm even happier to be able to share them with others. Jason's first image is Our Lady of Dilapidation. His second image is Home, Home Again. His third image, School's Out. Up next, no more fireside chats. The Great Blue Peel. And finally, Ivy League. Our next photographer is Martha Worth. Martha Worth's artist statements is as follows. I am an artist that photographs artists, circus performers, aerialists, dancers, and clowns. When last year hit and everything shut down, my friends' clients lost their livelihoods with no real way of knowing if it would ever come back. Imagine that you spend most days practicing your craft and most evenings are dressing up with amazing makeup and costumes to perform. Then one day, all that is gone. You have nowhere to perform, no creative outlet, and no income. It became like a sea of artists, adrift in a world of uncertainty. We all began to question so many things in our lives and face our deepest fears and doubts. I started to rethink my photographic purpose, both professionally and personally. I loved the idea that other photographers were doing portraits of families at their homes, and I wanted to mold it to my clientele, my circus people, my artists. I reached out to my performing arts community, asking if I could come and photograph them in their backyards, alleys, and neighborhoods. For a couple of weeks, I drove around with my camera, hearing stories of their pain, struggles, and depression. But there were also stories of rest, hope, and a new outlook on life. Amazing costumes and makeup were used again. Bodies were stretched and moving again, but most of all, the light in their eyes told me that life would be lived again. Those weeks of photo shoots changed a deeper part of me than I could ever imagine it would. And I hope that they helped change my community of performing artists as well. Martha's first photograph, Staza. Oops. Second photograph, Victoria. Her third photograph, Brian. Jill and Alex. Erica. And finally, Sarah. Our next photographer is John Altmorfor. His artist statement is as follows. I was bored. Honestly, I started asking people to let me take photos of them in August 2020 because I was bored. I didn't really want much out of all this, other than to take some photos of interesting people I knew. Mostly, we shot at the person's home, sometimes at my place, others walking around neighborhoods. The only rules of the project was that I didn't want people to get too glammed up and that there were no illusions of COVID in the photos. I pretty much used one camera with a cheap 35mm lens. Most of the time, I had no plan before I started shooting each person. We all made it up as we went along. I won the battle against boredom, and the project got interesting. I got to see glimpses of people and the places where they felt comfortable being themselves. On the other hand, I saw them struggle with settings that unsettled them. I had fun. Most of the people I shot did too. At least that's what they tell me. We haven't kicked COVID's ass yet, and I haven't stopped shooting people. One thing I know is that once the pandemic passes, I'll keep working on this project, but it's not because I'm bored. John's first image, untitled. John's second image, untitled. His third image, untitled. His fourth image, untitled. His fifth image, untitled. And his sixth image, untitled. Our next photographer is Brian Bogovich. Brian's artist statement is as follows. The idea of a prepared artist statement immediately sets off my sense of imposter syndrome. The portrait photography could certainly be considered to have some artistic merit, but the majority I would classify as documentation, and to call myself an artist feels unearned and just a bit pretentious. It's always been less about trying to communicate some form of creative vision than a way to overcome social anxiety and meet new people from a wide range of backgrounds and collaborate with them to try and produce something new. The end result is more of the product of constant improvisation in a chaotic situation than a planned process. The past year and a half has nearly entirely been defined by isolation and loss. I was fortunate to have uninterrupted employment since my company was already equipped for remote work. At the same time, I had dramatically underestimated the psychological toll that going months on end with virtually no in-person human contact would have. The video conferences simply aren't the same as being physically present, and social media served only to amplify the worst aspects of human nature, artificially accelerating a breakdown of social discourse as the world struggled to come to terms with a changed reality. For my part, I've lost a grandmother and an uncle to the pandemic, and nearly lost my sanity tending to a terminally ill cat I'd raised for 14 years. It's not been the best of times. Somehow, the periodic photo shoots continued despite everything that was happening, and in some way, became a bit of a lifeline to keep some level of real human contact. I'm thankful for everyone who's worked with me for helping me to stay sane through all that's happened. There have been fewer projects than usual, naturally, but that did allow for a lot more experimentation with lighting and post-processing techniques than having a larger number of shoots would allow for. Generally, I focus on trying to create a mood with the imagery and think that the recent work has been at least somewhat successful in that. Eventually, what I'm aiming to create is something of a dark fairy tale aesthetic and try to capture a slightly unsettling feeling, that seemingly omnipresent sense of discomfort that seems to fill the air these days. I am still working out exactly what would translate to visually, but it at least seems to be moving in some sort of direction. Towards what, I'm not entirely sure, but getting there will certainly be interesting. Brian's first image. Untitled. Brian's second image. Untitled. Brian's third image. Untitled. Brian's next image. Untitled. Brian's next image. Untitled. And Brian's final image. Untitled. Our next photographer is Dave Hochendonner. His artist statement is as follows. The 2020-2021 season has been unique. My journey in photography started with my dad letting me use his Kodak Duraflex 3 twin lens reflex camera, which I still have, when I was about 6 years old. A few years later, I built my own darkroom in our shower coal room, never used for coal. And after watching my first image magically appeared in the developer bath, I was hooked. For this show, I wanted to display my version of when a door closes, a window opens in black and white. I selected mostly photos of situations that allowed me to be part of others' lives, even for a short time, to provide them with photographic memories in this COVID time. Some happy, some sad, and some fun, just like life. Dave's first photograph. Untitled. Dave's second image. Untitled. His third image. untitled. This fourth image, untitled. This fifth image, untitled. And his final image, untitled. Our last photographer is Katie Evans. Katie's artist statements is as follows. In the beginning of the lockdowns, I was shocked that something like COVID could happen. I also began down a path that I'm sure many of us were fooled into thinking was right. While social media can be an amazing tool, it's also our worst enemy, and it's very hard to get off that path once we start down it. My husband said something to wake me up and see what was really happening. I didn't like the person I had started to become. I mentioned this on my Facebook and to my friends as I decided to take a break from the madness of it all. Having fake arguments with total strangers was leaking into my daily life at home. Even while my husband and I saw mostly eye to eye, we had heated discussions about the comments I made or responses that were being made to me. Around the same time, an old friend from the Philippines tagged me in a black and white 7-day photography challenge on Facebook. I grabbed my camera. During the 7 days, I took photos, mostly that were about light or movement. After the week of black and white, I tried some high-speed photography for a week or two, but started to want to do some portraits because I had just bought 2 hot shoe flashes from a photography friend in Michigan. My kids wouldn't sit still long enough for me, and my husband hates having those to pose for photos. This last spring, I found some inspiration in another photographer. Her name is Jamie Beck. She used whatever had inspired her and her surroundings during the lockdowns in Province to create something new every day. I have a few prints of hers, but I also tried to create my own images that reminded me of her work. However, photography isn't my only passion, and portrait photography has been pulling me, and it was difficult to be able to meet with people to do portraits during 2020. I started to think about the art supplies I had bought in 2017 that had been forgotten. I joined a Facebook group called Watercolor for Beginners and Beyond. While I've always seen myself as an artist, I had spent years comparing myself to others. I never thought of myself as a good enough artist to be involved in the arts. I started doing watercolors and had only been doing it for a few months. I asked a French photographer in a group I was on Facebook to use a black and white image they took. My practice was so good that they asked if I would paint them one to have. We did an artist trade for a print of one of his images of my choice. Afterwards, it pushed me to keep up with it. As my husband said, "You know you're good when a French artist takes notice of your work." It's crazy that I discovered myself as a true creative and have decided to become a full-time artist once my time allows for me to devote more time to my hobby turning career. While what this last year and a half has been nothing but madness for the world, I have rediscovered myself. I've been able to choose a path that has always felt right, but I've never allowed myself to believe that I could make it happen. Also, during this year and a half, because of something my husband said, I've become a more open person to new ideas, and because of the madness that has happened, I am trying to get over a them versus us mentality. Katie's first image. Open windows on a spring day. Strawberry high speed. Evening in front of the fireplace. Unfinished flamingos. Jamie Beck. Watercolor. Double poppies exposure. Watercolor. And that concludes our virtual exhibition. Thank you so much for your time and for your interest in our show. We really appreciate you joining us. Thanks again.